Welcome to part 2 on this sewing tutorial for this shirt. This is McCall's 6569 and it's sort of a cowboy shirt, a western shirt, and we're just putting a spin on it with the fabric that we've got. In part 1, and if you go into the description or into the Sew What playlist, you'll find a link to that video. If I've remembered to put a card up, that will pop up over here. And we got as far as getting the yoke onto the body, so this is all top stitched and pressed, front and back. And we got the fiddly button placket down the front. There's no buttons on it yet, no button holes. This will come after I've put the collar on. I like to do all of those all in one go. So for full details on how we get to this stage, go and check that video out. To see what we do next, well, grab a cuppa and see what we get to in this video. We are starting with the shoulder seams. This will be a French seam, and I will bring you in to show you how that works. They're a little bit counterintuitive, but they are quite a strong seam. And then we'll be putting the sleeves on, which is a little bit more of this sort of thing. When you sew seams, normally you want to be hiding the raw edges. And although you do hide the raw edge on a French seam, it's not the way you might expect if you've not done one before. If you want a quicker way of doing this, overlock or serge the edges and just straight stitch a seam. I prefer to do it with a French seam on my shirts. It helps them last a lot longer. It's a very tough seam. So you've got the front panel and the back panel here, and your various layers of fabric. And the first thing that you want to do is pin the shoulder seam together so that your raw edges are on the outside. One thing that does make it a bit easier is on the pattern that there are these little notches, so they line up, and that means you can see that your panel pieces are actually aligned. Once we've got that, we'll sew a seam along here. You want a fairly generous seam allowance, I would say at least the width of your finger, because once we've done that, we'll trim one side of the seam off. I'll show you that in a moment. It'll be a bit easier to see after I've sewn it. Most of the exterior seams on the shirt are going to be done with French seams. The sleeves are a little bit tricky, but I'll show you how you get around that. Here's one I prepared earlier, and this is what your French seam will look like when it's finished. And inside the shirt it looks like that. There are absolutely no raw edges anywhere. It's quite a hard wearing seam, and usually this seam outlives the shirt. Here's the side I haven't done. The first thing I've done here is I've just sewn the two pieces, the front and the back, together. Now remember, there's 4 layers here because we've got the yoke which is over the base layer of fabric, but treat it as just 2. And after I've sewn that seam in, I've then cut back one side by about half. I'm making sure that all of my seams go in the same direction, so do pay attention to that when you do it. It will just sit nicer, look a little bit nicer if all of your seams follow the same direction. So the longer edge is on the front, and we are going to fold it around so the raw edge reaches your stitch line, and then you fold it around again and it disappears. And that's how all of your raw edges are caught. We'll then top stitch along this very edge as close as we can. The closer to the edge you can get, the better, and that will trap all the raw edges inside. On a piece like this it's fairly easy. There's very good access, you can lay everything out very nice and flat, there's no curves. On some shapes, like the armholes, which we'll come to later, it is a little bit more difficult, but it's the same basic principle. Pop this on the sewing machine, I'll show you how we actually do this seam and how it looks as it goes together. If you've never done one of these before, they can be a little bit daunting, but once you do a few, they're very easy, and you'll wonder why you ever hauled out the overlocker once you learn how to do this. Everything's set up here on the machine. As usual, I'm using the zipper foot, which allows me to get really close to the edge, and I've rolled the fabric as I showed you on the mannequin and pinned everything in place. Again, you can baste this if you prefer, I just find pins easier. Do make sure when you do this that you go as close to this edge as you possibly can, because the fabric's going to want to unravel on you. It's going to want to come out of the shape you've got it, and you might not catch the raw edge, because you want that raw edge shoved right in against this seam line here. As you sew, take your time. Do make sure that your needle doesn't go wandering off one side or another, because it will want to, especially on slipperier fabrics. And also make sure that all of your fabric is laid out nice and flat as much as you possibly can. The last thing you want is to catch, like it to bunch up and get stuck underneath, because it's a chore to fix that. You might need to, as well as you go along, especially when you take the pins out, the fabric might try and unroll itself, so just keep an eye out for that and just keep poking it in as you go if you need to. It can help, as you take each pin out, just to very gently stretch the fabric a little bit. Don't pull hard enough it comes out from under the foot, just enough to put a little bit of tension on. It encourages this fold to stay where you want it, encourages all the raw edges to stay inside. There we are. That is a completely hidden raw edge, all sealed away. This tolerates going through the washing machine and quite a lot of wear and tear, and I really like this method for doing any sort of seams where you need something very, very strong. Little bit more time than your usual seams, but definitely worth it. Moving on to the sleeves next, and this bit's a bit strange the first time you do it, but it does make sense. On each sleeve there is a slot cut, so your cuff would come around here, and then this is the bit that just opens the sleeve up enough so you can get your hand through. It wants us to sew this continuous strip all the way around the slit in the sleeve, not in two pieces, in one piece. And you can actually do that. Start at the cuff end here and pin it along until you get to the point of the cut in the sleeve, and then you sort of lay the sleeve open flat and you can keep pinning. You then sew along this line and turn that fabric, so you got your seam allowance here, so that goes in there, and you turn that fabric all the way around. We'll also roll this edge as we go. It's a little bit easier to do once things are sewn together, but basically you'll be trapping this raw edge here and this raw edge here in a top stitch seam that you'll put on, and that protects all of this edge. You could probably do this with bias binding tape as well, but this is the way it asks you to do it, and this fabric matches the sleeve, so I'm going to do it as the pattern suggests. It's going to feel a bit strange doing this one because your fabric's going to want to do all of this nonsense. Ignore it. Only focus on the slit that's made in the sleeve, because that's the only area of concern. And you want to go for a fairly small seam allowance on this one. The less fabric you've got to deal with when you start rolling and pressing everything, the easier this will be. And we want to sew along until we get to the point of the cut, which at the moment is just about here. You know when you're getting up to it because the fabric wants to do all kinds of weird crinkly things, so as you get close, you just want to make sure you're not trapping any fabric and puckering it. Now I like to leave the needle in and lift the foot, and then you can just rejig everything to make sure everything's nice and flat, because it's this point that's the awkward bit. Once you get past that, much easier. And there we are. That's one continuous seam, and you can see the actual piece wants to lay kind of flat. You know, it kind of does this sort of thing. And you do want it to do that, that's good. There's not any horrible puckering up at the top here. That's all nice and level. The next job is to press this. I would recommend, before you actually sew, just roll this edge over a tiny bit and press it. It will make things a bit easier when you do the top stitch. I'm going to press this and then I'll bring you back to show you what I mean. As with the French seam, your goal here is just to hide and trap the raw edges. So once you've sewn your piece on and you've ironed over the edge to make it easier, you then roll the whole thing up basically, so your edge is trapped inside. I couldn't really get this on camera without my hands being in the way because this is such a small piece. When you're done, you will find it looks a little bit like this. And I've just pinned everything down. You may prefer to use some basting stitches, it's a bit more flexible. And at the top here, you want the small piece, and you're looking at it from the inside, to be over the big piece of your sleeve. And to do that, the fabric will want to do this all on its own. You'll find it goes from being laid out like this to sort of that way, and you sort of wiggle this about until it folds over itself. There's a little diagram here that sort of shows what I mean. If ever you've played about with ribbon and you try to get it fold just so to go around a corner, that's what you're doing here. Then top stitch along this edge, just as we did with the French seam. You want to go fairly close to the edge if you can, and just be careful on this top bit here because that's quite difficult to actually get your sewing machine around. Sometimes there's a lot of thickness change of fabric up here compared to down here. And with all that done, you'll then be able to press it, and that fitted little bit of the sleeve will be finished. The main reason for this, apart from just being the opening to get your hand in, is it stops where the fabric is cut to here continuing to tear up the sleeve, which obviously you do not want, and that's what this piece here does. All finished. And yeah, I would have liked to have shown you that in a bit more detail, but it really is quite difficult. When you're sewing these, it's very straightforward. You're just rolling and sewing. They're not that hard to do. Like I say, the important things are, remember that the smaller side of the sleeve, beyond this split here, goes underneath. So you can see here, now that it's pressed, how that overlaps in that corner. In the pattern it does say to sew a diagonal line here, and that will be just to hold this together. But I prefer not to, because I don't find I need to, and it's quite difficult to get everything sewn together tidily there. You can see as well my top stitching isn't brilliant. This is one of the things that I'm not great at. Very tiny details like this. Yeah, I need more practice, but hey, I'm not a professional. I'm just an amateur, showing you my sewing journey and demonstrating that chasing perfection is a bad idea in sewing, because realistically, who's going to be this close to you to critique how straight your stitching is or isn't? It's not a competition, it's something to wear to go down to the shop in. So it's fine, it'll do, it's good enough, and as we all know here, good enough is definitely good enough. Right, next thing is hand sewing. We need to gather in this sleeve cap a little bit so that it fits nicely into the body. The next job here is to set in the sleeves, and our first challenge for that is to actually run a gathering stitch along the top. Now you can do this on the machine if your machine has that setting. I'd have to fiddle about with tension and stuff on mine because it's a very old basic thing. So I prefer to hand sew it, it's a bit quicker for me. I picked this thread because I thought it would show up, and it doesn't really. Sorry about that. But it's very simple. You just, about my thumb's width, so like a finger and a half, and you go in and out of your fabric with your needle, roughly in line with your raw edge, and then just pull your thread through. You don't want to make it too tight, you want a fairly loose fit, and don't tie off your end, you want to leave a tail. And we'll do that along the entire sleeve cap. That's the sticky out curved bit on the top. It's funny, this is part of putting sleeves in most people don't like, and I think the problem is people try and do it perfectly, and as with a lot of sewing, when you chase perfection you tend to end up with disappointment. So I would recommend do not chase perfection with this. Good enough is good enough. You can be quite sloppy with your stitches. This isn't going to make the cap gathered or ruffled or anything like that. It just gives it a very subtle amount of fullness and smooths it over your shoulder just a little bit nicer than if you didn't do it. It's a tiny bit more comfortable as well. And I forgot to mention, there's a couple of little notches, and that's what we're running this seam between, because that's the area that you're taking up the extra fabric. Lighter weight fabrics work better with this. This is quite a heavy cotton for a shirt, and it does it. It's fine. I've already done the other side, but it's not quite as easy as a lighter cotton. Right, just make sure you've got a good tail on each end, and all you want to do is just bring the fabric in a little bit. Now this is one of those, it's another one of those sewing jobs where you're doing it mostly by feel and experience, but you want it to feel sort of wrinkly without being able to see wrinkles. I can't think of a better way of describing it, because you don't want this to be visible when it's sewn in. This will make more sense when we sew it, but you want it, I hope the light will catch. Can you see how that's just a little bit wavy? That's sort of how you want it to be. We'll pin this to the body, and then a lot of that will disappear, but what that's doing is it's shrinking the fabric down, so sort of compressing your fibres together, so that when you sew it there's more fabric in the space, but there's no visible sign that you've done that, because we'll pull this thread out afterwards. I'm making this a little bit more difficult for myself because I'm doing this as a French seam. If you don't have the confidence to do that, I would recommend overlocking this seam or just sewing it normally with a straight stitch and then hand catching this raw edge with a blanket stitch or similar, just to stop the fraying, and then you should be fine. If you're a bit more confident with it and you're not worried about whether or not it's absolutely perfect, then do a French seam because it's a bit more robust. And to begin with, on your pinning, you have some notches on the sleeve and the body that line up. So you can pin from there to the edge as normal, no problem. But it's the spot between the notches where you've done the hand sewing, that's where it gets a little bit different. So if you find roughly where the middle of your sleeve is, I know where that is because there's a little dragonfly, although these might be mayflies, thinking about it. There's a bug, so that's roughly where the middle is. So I know that roughly wants to be where the centre seam is for the shoulder. And this just helps me balance out the gathering either side. Now you can see there's quite a bit too much fabric here, and that's what we're aiming to squash down. And it's a little bit tricky to show you. You just sort of wiggle and massage everything until it gets about where you want it.
Now then, that's everything pinned in. I'm going to do the sewing on this off camera because I need to concentrate on it. But it's exactly the same process as doing the shoulder seam that we did earlier. The difficulty is because this is a curve and gathered slightly, it will want to make little tiny pleats. If it does make one, you can always pop the seam and sort of shuffle and squash the fabric around to level it out, and you can usually get something that's acceptable. The trouble is when you come to actually rolling everything to catch those raw edges, it can be difficult. The fabric can fight you. I'm finding this fabric behaves quite well, so we should be okay. I shall bring you back when I've done this. Also, I need to tell you how to decide which sleeve is which side, so I'll cover that as well in just a moment. It's always the one I do off camera that goes better, so I thought I'd bring you back just to have a look. You can see how this sleeve cap holds a bit of a shape. So it wants to actually be that sort of curved over your shoulder shape. That's as well part of this. And there's no puckers or gathers or anything like that in there. It looks almost like just an ordinary seam. First thing to do is just pull out that thread that we put in. Nice and easy. And now I need to do the rest of the French seam. So I'm going to be rolling this hem over to the collar side rather than the sleeve side. So I shall have to trim off the excess fabric like we did on the shoulder seam. But when you actually put this together, let's put this on the mannequin and I'll show you. It's a little bit easier to explain there.
Here in real time, rather than YouTube time, it's lunchtime, so I shall be taking a break in a moment. But first, I wanted to talk to you about the sleeves. Now we've got them sewn on. I've done the seam around here just the same as the one on the shoulder. And you can see the shirt is now actually taking on a pretty decent shape. I've raised the mannequin a good bit taller than I am, so you can see us both. We're nearly finished with the sleeves. There is the seam here, and that will be one French seam from the cuff all the way to the bottom of the shirt on both sides, just pinned at the moment. But when you decide which side is which on your sleeves, the easiest way to do it is put the sleeves on. Not on the garment, but on yourself. So pin or use clothes pegs just to hold the bottom seam shut and put it on your arm. You'll know if it's the right or the left because the cuff will hang in the right place. So for example, on this shirt you can see the cuff hangs down there, big cuff link there to help. And if you've got the shirt sleeve on the wrong arm, it will sit like that. So you'll instantly know which side is which. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you're trying to figure out which side of you a piece of the garment belongs, best thing to do is put it on your own body. You'll soon learn. I'm going to go and have my lunch, and when I come back I'll do this seam, I'll do these cuffs, and then we'll see about getting the collar on. This is the side seam that runs from the bottom of the shirt down there all the way to the cuff up here. And once you've got everything sewn together that we've done so far, this will be your next seam. This will basically turn it into a shirt that you can wear. I've already run the seam. We're doing a French seam again, remember? And I've trimmed it back on the back of the shirt because I want the seam to roll towards the back. Make sure that when you do your side seams they both roll in the same direction. So if you've chosen to roll them to the back, make sure both sides are, otherwise it can sometimes feel a little bit funny. The next task is to very carefully roll and pin this. So remember, you take your longer raw edge and go to your seam line, and then you fold it over again. But you have to be a little bit careful on this one, because if you do it that way you'll end up with a seam that sticks out, which you don't want. So instead
you have to put your fabric like this and then roll it and pin it down, and it's a bit of a faff. I have tried to do this on camera and I couldn't do it. So what I do is I tend to put one hand inside the sleeve as I've rolled it, and I start my pinning. I start at the cuff and I work my way to the underarm seam here, and then I work from the bottom of the shirt up to the underarm, and that makes it a little bit easier to make sure that I'm not pinning the shirt to itself. As I say, I really struggled to do this on camera, so I'm going to pin this all together off camera, and I will then show you how to sew this together and keep the seam flat without sewing it to itself. There is a knack to it. I find this easiest to start from the hem of the shirt and work up the seam towards the cuff. So when you put your pins in, make sure that the head of the pins is at the cuff end of the seam. And this is where the knack is involved. You have to make sure that your fabric is kept nice and flat, and your work area is basically just going to be this tiny little circle here, and that's what you've got to keep flat. You've got to stop the shirt from coming up underneath here and getting snagged. You really do have to take your time and be careful on this, but it gives a lovely seam when it's done, so it is worth the effort. So machine problems. Sometimes when you cut your thread off from the last run, it picks it up and drags it in front. You can unpick it and tidy it afterwards. It's not a big problem. As you work, you want to keep sort of brushing the fabric out as you go, and this will help just keep everything nice and flat. As you get up to the sleeve, as we're just approaching the sleeve here, you'll find that the shirt sort of tries to pull off towards you, so just keep shuffling it and moving it and keep an eye on it as you go, because you don't want the weight of it to pull you off where you're sewing. And just as well, rummage underneath and just check everything's nice and flat and you're not getting fabric doubling up on the layers and things. This is another one of those sewing jobs where it's much easier to understand when you actually do it yourself than it is for me to show you on camera. But hopefully you're getting an idea of what you have to do here. Right, we are now just about to start on the sleeve, and this is where it gets the trickiest, because what will happen, this side of the sleeve here that you can see is fine, but because of the tube of it, if you like, the side of the sleeve that you can't see will try and come up. So you do have to feel with your fingers as you go to make sure you've just got the one thickness of fabric here. Some fabrics that's easier than others. This one is quite good because this fabric's fairly thick for a shirt. Slightly right. My seam came unrolled there as I took the pin out. as you get further and further down, so your sleeve's here and it's this side of the fabric you don't want to bunch up, so you'll find that if you just sort of pull it out, it will flatten out in front of you for the machine and you should be okay. When I first started making clothes without using commercial patterns years and years ago, this, along with trying to turn waistcoats the right side out when you'd sewn them up, was easily one of the most challenging things to figure out. There just wasn't the information online that there is now. There weren't really tutorial videos either, so I was flying a bit blind. But we figured it out. And that's one of the fun challenges with sewing, is you have these little problems to solve. You can see I'm just, as you go further along the sleeve, it starts to create sort of a little pot, Yorkshire pudding sort of a thing. It highlights what I said at the start of the seam, where you're working in just this tiny little spot in the middle here and everything else you sort of ignore. As long as everything here is as it should be, you're okay. Getting towards the end. It does start to get a little bit tricky, because of course you're getting more and more fabric bulking up around your machine as well, so that's something to be aware of. Especially if you're using a more delicate fabric that might snag on the mechanism. This is quite tough, but sometimes you might find that if your machine's got bits and pieces on the back, you might have to keep an eye on that. Thankfully these old Singers are fairly smooth all over, so they are very kind when you're trying to do fiddly stuff like this. There we go. Lift your needle and foot out of the way. Trim off your thread, and then you have to feed everything back through. Oh, that went fairly smoothly. Super. And I haven't caught any of the fabric on my way through. That's how you do the underarm seam. It's probably one of the trickier ones if you're wanting to French seam things. But again, I do think it's worth it. You end up with no sort of loose threads or anything inside, nothing visible on outside, nice strong seam, and it looks just really smart. It stops it looking fancy dress. This stage is completed. I'm quite pleased with how it's turned out. No, it's not perfect. Very rarely is my sewing perfect, mainly because I don't chase perfection. I just make things that I'm happy with, and I think that's a goal that you should aim for too. If you're new to sewing or experienced with sewing, you should always just do as good as you are happy with. There's no point chasing perfection. That said, I am very pleased with how this is coming together, and I have taken care with my seams and that sort of thing. So overall, I think this is looking pretty good. The sleeves are all on. These are now ready to have the cuffs done on them. The collar is going to be one of the next big jobs to do. They're a little bit complicated. I could probably do a video just on collars, to be honest with you. Buttons, obviously, to go on the front, and then the other thing to finish off will be the hem. The hem's fairly simple.
thankfully, and it'll be ready to wear. For now, I'm going to say thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode. Don't forget that if you want to keep track of what projects we've got going on here, especially short tutorial series like this, best thing to do is subscribe, and you will then always catch the videos. I don't know whether or not the algorithm suggests me to people, it probably doesn't, so by subscribing you'll always get those updates. There's plenty more information in the description below if you want to know a bit more about what I do, and any links to any products or anything like that that I've used will be down there as well. Time of recording, nothing is sponsored, no affiliate links, it's just this. So yeah, any support's good, any feedback, any interaction is good. And hopefully I'll see you in the next episode when we should finish this shirt and I can show you it actually on a person instead of just on the mannequin.